The legendary tale of Reformation Sunday tells us that on that 31st day of October in 1517, Martin Luther, a local university professor and associate pastor, nailed defiantly a notification of his protest on the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg. His 95 statements or theses were a list of abuses and errors from his perspective that he believed were corruption of the faith and the purpose and the mission of the church. So in reality, the 95 theses that Luther posted were probably not posted at all, but were sent on ahead by courier to the archbishop of his diocese. And the list wasn't really a defiant protest as much as it was a sincere call on the part of Luther to address some of the problems that he had seen and felt and experienced within the gospel message, things that he thought were blocking the ability of the people of God from hearing the good news of Jesus Christ. So regardless of which side of the story is true, regardless of his mood or the purpose behind what he wrote, the bottom line is that he really desired that a conversation would start in the church to talk about some of these issues that he saw as being problem areas. He really wanted people to know the joy that he had experienced in his own life as he had come to know the forgiveness of sins. The words of Romans 3:19-28, which is what Roger read for you just a moment ago, had stirred a fire deep in his soul. And after years of feeling guilt and all of the guilty feelings that went along with that he could never be forgiven because he was such a horrible person, he was now filled with joy because he had experienced the grace of God in his life and knew that he had been forgiven. And he wanted everybody to have that same experience. Little did he know the enormous impact that his one act, that one simple act on October 31st, would have across the church. His willingness to stand up against the Pope and the Emperor in the name of the gospel changed the whole face of history, and it changed the whole face of the entire Christian church. Now, Luther never intended to separate himself from the Roman church, not at all. To his dying day, he saw himself as a faithful priest of the church, but he sought to have some kind of reforms that would make it easier for people to see Jesus. He wanted people to see Jesus. And in his understanding of the scriptures that came out of that Romans 3 passage, which is going to be the center for our text today, he understood that we are not forgiven because of anything that we do. The forgiveness that we receive is solely the work of God. We're forgiven because of who God is. We're loved and forgiven because God is a God of grace and mercy. So the passage from Romans was the key to his own personal transformation. It turned out to be the transformation of the whole Christian faith. He wanted to reform the church. Reformation Day is what we celebrate. But in the end, it ended up causing a schism. But which was much to his dismay. Because from Luther's perspective, he and the church agreed on most things. They agreed, for example, they agreed that everybody has a sin problem, that there is no one who is righteous. All people, both Jew and Gentile, the text says, have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Even to this very day, the Jews think they get some kind of a special pass because of the Old Testament portrayal of them as the people of God. But Paul makes it clear there's no difference. Neither Jew nor Gentile is exempt. All have sinned. And as my college professor used to say, all means all, and that's all means. All have sinned. Nobody's exempt from it. We all have sinned, whether we're Jew or Gentile, whether we are American or not American, wherever we may be. Every person has sinned. Now, you and I don't need to be told that, right? We know we're sinners. We don't have to have anybody argue that point with us. We don't struggle on that at all. We have no shortage of things to say when it comes time in the course of the worship service for us to confess our sins, when Kathy led that in this morning. Our issue usually is that whoever the liturgist is doesn't pause long enough for us to get everything in. We have a lot of things that we want to confess. From time to time, people will ask me, or will say something to me along the line, "Oh, I really can't go to your church. You don't know the things that I've done in my past." Well, all have sinned. I mean, if somebody has committed sin, even a horrendous sin, and they come here, they fit right in because we're all sinners. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. I usually tell them that the only person who won't feel comfortable in this church is somebody who's perfect, because they'll be the one who's different from everybody else. All sin, we all belong. We all come into the faith at this particular point in time. Where do we need to be if we're a sinner? We need to be in church. We need to be where the gospel is being preached and proclaimed. And Luther didn't disagree with anybody there. Luther also didn't disagree with the church that only the righteous can get into heaven. That was another point of agreement with us. The text tells us that the whole world, that the whole world is held accountable to God. And then it goes on to tell us that the standard for admission into heaven is perfection, being righteous. So what's it take to get to be righteous? How do we get to be righteous? To be good enough in the sight of God. Let's suppose for a minute that a really, really good person lived. And that really, really, really good person only committed 3 sins a day. 1 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon, and 1 at night. That was it. 3 sins a day. And that really, really good person lived to be 80 years old. By the time of their 80th birthday, they would have committed 87,600 sins. Now, nearly 90,000 sins from somebody who's really, really good. What do you suppose our numbers add up to? Maybe a little bit farther than that. I don't need to get to 80 to surpass that number, right? But the Bible tells us that only one sin is enough to knock us out. One sin is not perfection. And the standard for our admission into heaven is the perfection of God. The only way we can get in is for us to be declared righteous. Luther and the church both agreed that that was the case. And then the third area where they agreed was that those first 2 statements, they create a major problem. The first 2 statements create a major problem because if all sin and fall short of the glory of God, and the only way to get into heaven is to have no sin in your life, what's our hope? How do we ever hope to get in? That's the same experience that Isaiah felt when he went into the temple in that 6th chapter of Isaiah. He's in the temple. He's in the presence of this holy and majestic God, and what he sees there as he hears as the God is being proclaimed, as he sees how unholy he is. And so he writes the words that are in Isaiah chapter 6. If you advance the slide for it, oh, you got it there. Woe is me, he says. I'm ruined. I'm a man of unclean lips, living among a people of unclean lips. And that's pretty much the predicament that we're in. In the presence of a holy God, you and I know we're not holy. We've got a problem. There has to be a way to fix it. I was in a meeting of the gathering this last couple of weeks, and the speaker was talking about his own conversion experience. And he said in there, it wasn't so much that I wanted to go to heaven, but I definitely didn't want to go to hell. And that was where, and that was kind of where a lot of people are. The idea of going to hell scares us to death. And we may not necessarily want to go to heaven, but if the only option is that to go to hell, we definitely don't want to go there. And so we have to be able to fix this problem. How do we get ourselves into a place where hell is not our destination, but we're headed to someplace else? There has to be a way. And that's where Luther and the church part ways. So there were 2 options that he had to address there. The first option is this, and this is the way where the church generally came down. It's all about what you do. It's all about what you do. In other words, they might say it like this: you got yourself into this mess, it's up to you to get it out. You got yourself into this mess, you need to get yourself out. You need to do something to fix this problem. You're the one that sinned, you need to do something to take corrective action on what it may be. But look at verse 20. Verse 20 says, there's no one who will be declared righteous in God's sight by the works of the law. Rather, it's through the law we became conscious of our sin. In other words, everything that you and I try to do is a work of the law. It's something that we try to do to remedy that sin problem. But none of us can do anything to make that happen. None of us can make that change. And everything falls under that works of the law category. Back in Jesus' day, the Jews had a list of 613 special kind of corollaries to the law that you didn't want to break any of them if you wanted to be perfect, if you wanted to be right before God. Well, things like you don't get your ox out of a hole on the Sabbath day. You don't shave your beard with a razor. You don't put a tree in the temple courtyards. You make sure that your food's kosher, and on and on and on and on and on. All those certain things that happen. You mess up, you offer a sacrifice for it, you start the process all over again. But all of that didn't get us to a place of righteousness. You and I don't have 613 rules, maybe, but you and I have in our heads some things that we want to do to make sure that God's always happy with us. If we do this, God will be happy. Oh, I forgot my devotions today. What's going to happen now? Oh, I missed church. We have all of these things that we think are going to be involved in that process, but it's not the things that we do that make us righteous before God. Those rules do have an important purpose, the text tells us. It's not to make us righteous, but according to the text, when we do those things, that makes us so that we understand what the sin is. If there wasn't a law that said do not covet, you'd never know what coveting was. Which brings us to this second point, this second option. Luther says if the first one doesn't work, and it didn't from Luther's experience, and we know it doesn't from ours, that the first one about us working hard enough to get ourselves out of, the only other option is we have to rely upon what God does. And it becomes all about what Jesus does on our behalf. The righteousness, the text says, that is given through faith in Jesus Christ is given to everyone who believes. It's given to everyone who believes. I'm going to give you a theological word here so you should know I went to seminary. The word is imputed. Imputed. So I was putting that word into my sermon this week. I thought, you know what? That's a common thought for us computer people today because of the inputs that happen. Inputs, we put the information into the computer. We put it in. Imputed simply means this: God put into you his righteousness. He put it into you. Why do you have righteousness? If you've confessed faith in Jesus Christ, but not because of anything you did, but because Jesus Christ put it into you. He put it into you. Verse 28 says, we maintain that a person is justified by faith apart from the law. That's how it gets presented in that text. Justified. Another fancy theological term. It seems that there was a man who was in England who put his Rolls Royce on a boat and went across to the continent for a vacation. And while he was driving around in Europe, something happened to the motor of his car. And so from the continent, he called back to the dealership in England, the Rolls Royce dealership in England, and said, I'm having trouble with my car. What should I do? Well, the Rolls Royce people flew a mechanic over. The mechanic repaired the car and flew back to England and left the man to continue with his vacation. All along, this man is thinking, wonder what this is going to cost me. So when he got back to England, he wrote to the headquarters of the Rolls-Royce company, and he said, how much do I owe you? He actually called them and said, how much do I owe you? The secretary who answered the phone says, let me research this and I'll get back with you. A few days later, he gets a letter in the mail that says this, Dear sir, there is no record anywhere in our files that anything has ever gone wrong with a Rolls-Royce in the history of Rolls-Royces. That's justification. All evidence of the sin in our lives has been erased by what Jesus Christ does. You can't do that. Only Jesus can do that. He puts into us his righteousness. In churches like ours, Reformation can never be just another day. A day when we add a few extra songs and some Martin Luther songs and some Martin Luther prayers, and we make some special music. We get out the red clothes and we light an extra candle. All those things. It can never be just that day, because the message of Reformation is the central message of the Christian church. It's a message that says only Jesus can make you fit for heaven. You can't do it on your own. You can't do anything that would make yourself even close to being worthy for what heaven is. There's no other religion, no other philosophy, no amount of effort on your part. It's only Jesus that can make that difference. It's always a good day for us, once a year, to remind ourselves that there are many people in this world who don't understand that truth. There are many people, and you know a lot of them, who are still trying to look for ways to make God like them. who are still looking for ways to try to make themselves worthy of who God is. There are many of us even who still fret whether or not we're doing the right things, or when something bad happens to us, whether or not we're getting punished for something that we didn't do or did do. But that's not what the Scriptures teach us, is it? The Scriptures teach us that it's not based on our efforts. The answer is only in Jesus Christ. No matter where you're at in your walk of faith, it's only Jesus that can make a difference for you. The Scriptures actually tell us this: if you declare with your mouth that Jesus is the Lord, and you believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For it is with your mouth that you believe and are justified, and it's with your heart that you believe and are justified. It's with your mouth that you profess your faith and are saved. It's not about you. It's about him. And to God be the glory for that. Amen.